So, in our recent discussions on public-private partnerships, two things should have become clear. One is that a large number of governments across the world have tried adopting PPPs, and therefore, if you look at the sheer number of PPPs that have been enacted across sectors and across countries, that's a voluminous number. But if you also recall this other slide that you just saw a short while ago, we had some data that said that most of these PPP projects were not performing adequately in terms of whatever objectives they were trying to realize, whether it was completion on time, completion under budget, providing value to society, etc. Right? And this is a key issue because a lot of people complain that PPPs we've had more failures than successes, right? But very often this is because not because PPP per se is a bad concept. I think private participation in infrastructure, as I've just noted earlier, is extremely important. But the way in which the PPP is enacted right, is often problematic. The way in which risks are being transferred from the public sector to the private sector is often done incorrectly. The private sector or the public sector has risks that they are not able to bear, and therefore when those risks arise on the project, they are not able to mitigate those and the project starts unraveling, right. So, one of the questions that people often ask is, how do I decide whether a project is PPP-able or not, and more importantly, PPP is not a unitary concept, right. There are different kinds of PPPs. You have the build, operate, transfer PPP, you have the build, own, operate, transfer PPP variety, you have the design, build, operate, transfer. So, then the question is, which model of PPP, if any, is appropriate to a given project context. So, what we want to do now is get into a little bit more detail and start looking specifically at case studies of PPP projects, and we will talk about two case studies going forward, one of which is a relatively successful PPP, one of which is a PPP that is not so successful, and we will try to sort of understand what makes PPPs tick, what makes certain PPPs successful, certain PPPs failures, and how we might actually judge a project opportunity to decide whether this should be done through a public-private partnership or through traditional government procurement mechanisms, right. So, that is our agenda for the next 45 minutes or so. But before we get into the case studies, there is a theoretical framework that I want to present. This is not my theoretical framework, this is a theoretical framework that was developed by a gentleman called Antonio Vives and some of his collaborators and colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank is like the World Bank, it is a multilateral financial institution, but like the Asian Development Bank focuses primarily on Asia for its lending, the Inter-American Development Bank focuses primarily on Latin America, South America, those regions of the world for their lending. So, Antonio Vives spent several years trying to implement PPPs as part of the Inter-American Development Bank, and he and his colleagues have conceptualized and compartmentalized all that they have learned to create a framework that helps you understand whether you should undertake PPPs at all, and if you were to undertake a PPP, what kind of PPP you should undertake, right. This framework, it's actually been written into a document. It's about 40-45 pages. It's a very interesting readable document, and we've provided a link to that document as well, but I'll summarize that for you. So, it's not sort of the summary of the entire framework because that would be too voluminous, but I'm going to sort of summarize that framework in a slightly caricatured form, in a slightly simplified form, okay. So, this is what it looks like. Let us say that you have a particular project and you have 4 broad choices that you can make. You can either say, I will just do this project through the traditional government procurement mechanisms, right. So, that would be the public route, okay. The second is to say, no, what I will do is I will get a private operator in, but that private operator will not be required to build the facility, I will. The private operator essentially just needs to manage the facility. So, they will essentially operate the facility. This is quite common. For instance, many water and supply agencies across India use management contracts for the management of their pumping stations and so on and so forth, right. So, this is no longer entirely public, there is a private partnership, but the private partnership is somewhat minimal. The private player comes in essentially just to manage the operations of an asset that is already built, and in some cases they might have to do a little bit of refurbishment to the asset, but their capital outlay is relatively small, okay. So, that is the management contract. Then you get to, okay, we will bring the private sector in, but they will no longer just manage an existing asset or do some minor refurbishments, they will actually build the asset, right. So, they will bring in the finances, they will build the asset, whether it is a road, whether it is a sewage treatment plant, a power plant, a desalination plant, they will not only build it, but they will also operate it, right. This is the traditional PPP that most people think about, the traditional build, operate, transfer kind of public private partnership, right. And the final step is to take a decision saying, look, let's just completely privatize, right? A build, operate, transfer, still the ownership of the asset rests within the public sector. So a concession is given over a period of time, and after about 30 odd years or whatever the concession period is, the asset is transferred back to the public sector. So the public sector has leased that asset or given a concession for the use of that asset to the private sector, but underlying philosophy is it still owns the asset. In privatization, the underlying philosophy is you take the asset and essentially you give it to the private sector, you sell it to the private sector and you say, this is no longer my asset, you do with it what you will. So you are in charge of investing in that asset, you are in charge of operating, maintaining, changing the very nature of that asset, all of that is yours, right. So that is the pure privatization route, right. So when you have the opportunity of say building a road, right, or building a water treatment facility, a sewage treatment plant, you could say let the government just do all of it, right, or you could say let the government build it, let the private sector operate and manage it, or you could say let the private sector build it, operate and manage it, but transfer it back to the government over a period of time, or you could say let the private sector just handle the asset completely, let's just privatize, okay. So these are your 4 choices, okay. The leftmost choice is the clear public sector choice. The other 3 columns, well 3, 4 and 5, right, these columns are all various shades of private sector involvement, right. So this is why I said earlier that PPP is not a single thing, there are various kinds of PPPs. I have only put 3 here. If you read Antonio Vives' document, you will find that he has another dozen sort of categories of PPPs which essentially go from very minimal private sector involvement to considerable private sector involvement, right. So these are your choices. Should I do it within the public domain? Should I do it as a PPP? If I were to do it as a PPP, which model of PPP would be the most appropriate, right. Now in order to make these decisions, right, Antonio says let's look at a few parameters, right. The first parameter is let's see if there is an existing legal framework for PPPs or not, okay. If there is the second, and I will go through these parameters and then I will explain what they are. Second parameter is there political willingness to undertake PPPs, okay. So an existing legal framework implies, is there a policy, is there an act, is there some kind of is there a government order or an executive order, is there some legal underpinning that allows people to just undertake PPPs without really being concerned about the consequences of some lawmaker coming back and say you did something that is unconstitutional. That is what an existing legal framework is. Many states in India for instance have a legal framework. I was just talking earlier about how the Tamil Nadu government has something called the Tamil Nadu Infrastructure Development Act. Andhra Pradesh has one, many other states have one. States that do not have a legal framework often have a PPP policy, etc. So there is some legal framework, right. That was aspect 1. Second aspect is there political willingness, right. Is the elected representative, right, the minister or whoever is in charge of a particular portfolio, are they ready to undertake this project to PPP, because as I said earlier they are the ones who will have to sign off on undertaking the PPP, right. Third, what is the financial situation of the government like, and that is what we call fiscal space, right. Does the government have adequate funds to undertake projects, or does the government not have adequate funds to undertake projects, right. This is another aspect to think about. What is the nature of the economy, right? Is the economy going through an upswing? Are we a very stable economy looking to grow, or is that region or state or nation in economic turmoil? What is the level of economic stability is a 4th parameter that Antonio and his colleagues request that we consider, right. The 5th parameter that they request that we consider is institutional capacity. Is there capability within the government to write the contract for PPP, to monitor the PPP? Do they have the capability of undertaking the project process from procurement to contracting to operating to checking the construction, all of that, right, whether it is done within government or whether it is done outside, right, to what extent do they have the capability of undertaking these kinds of projects, right. What is the view of the public at large who are going to use this project? Are they willing to pay, right, is one question we have to ask. The second question we have to ask is, are they able to pay? And these are 2 subtle things. I might have enough money, I am able to pay, my ability to pay is high, but I may not be willing to pay, right. I believe that the government should provide roads and water supply and power for free because I am paying taxes. I am not willing to pay anything extra to make these projects happen, right. So willingness to pay and ability to pay are 2 very different things. Ability to pay essentially looks at, do you have enough wealth to pay if required? Willingness to pay says, given that you might have wealth, are you actually willing to pay to sustain this project? And then finally, how big is the project? What are the project economics? Are these projects that private organizations would be interested in bidding for, because they see that there is a profit to be made? Or are these projects that are so small, or projects where the returns are so low that private organizations are not really willing to bid for these projects, right? So Antonio and his colleagues say essentially, let's analyze each of these parameters in the context of a particular project. If a legal framework for PPPs does not exist, right, we don't have a law, we don't have an executive order, we don't have a policy, then essentially just undertake the project in the public domain. Right, don't even try going in for a PPP, because A, you may not find people who are ready to come forth and execute the PPP, because they'll be confused as to whether the existing laws allow it. But also going forward, if that project were to be enacted, it's very easy for somebody to take these projects to court, because there is no legal framework underlying these projects, right? So just do it in the public domain. Similarly, if you don't have political willingness, then again just do it in the public domain, right? Don't try for a PPP where you don't have political willingness, because it's very unlikely that people will sign off and execute that project on a PPP. You will probably spend a lot of time and money preparing that project for no obvious result on the ground, and therefore it might be better to just stick to a public procurement. On the other hand, if the government does not have enough funds to undertake the project, then it might be very important or might be very relevant to consider doing a PPP. So all these diamonds represent the case where that particular parameter is absent. So absence of a legal framework, do it through traditional procurement methods. Absence of political willingness for a PPP, do it with traditional procurement methods. Absence of fiscal space, right, the absence of financial capability to undertake these projects, let's look at the private sector and see if they can actually bring in funding for these projects. If your economy is highly stable, it's expected to grow, then you would expect that, for instance, there will be more traffic on the roads, more people are going to buy cars, right, and therefore as a result you will get more revenue from toll on these roads, and therefore your project will do quite well. People who are PPPs would actually be quite profitable, right? Whereas if your economy is not growing, people are losing jobs, so they're not able to buy cars to travel on that road, they don't have a reason to travel because they're not working, they've lost their jobs, then a PPP project may not do that well, right? So economic stability, if the economic stability is poor, right, essentially stick to either public sector procurement or maybe a very light private involvement, okay? Institutional capacity, does the government have the capacity to understand the risks with regards to PPPs? Does government have the capacity to structure a contract? Does government have capacity to monitor that contract, right? If the answer is no, then clearly you're better off sticking to either public procurement or a very light form of PPP that doesn't require high capacity, right? Again, willingness to pay, are people willing to pay tolls, are people willing to pay some kind of a tax or a charge for the use of that asset, right? If the answer is yes, then you could certainly do a PPP, but if the answer is no, people are not willing to pay, then it's probably a bad idea to do a PPP. If people are not willing to pay for a toll road, right, if they believe that we have paid taxes to the government should build my roads and I should not be paying tolls to go on that road, if that is the belief, right, if there is no willingness to pay, then there is no point building a build, operate, transfer kind of road where a private operator builds the road, expects to generate revenue through toll, but people are not willing to pay toll, right? And therefore it's better when there is no willingness to pay to do projects on the public domain, okay? Similarly, with regards to ability to pay, right, forget willingness, if people don't even have the ability to pay, again because the economic strength of that region is low, then how are you going to sustain a PPP? How is a private operator going to make revenue out of that PPP, right? So it's probably better to keep it in the public domain, right? And if the project is not large enough that a private player would be interested in taking some risk on it, then again you might throw that project out in a bid process, but what you will probably find is hardly anybody will come and volunteer to take up that project, and therefore in those cases it's probably better to undertake that project in the public domain, right? So what Antonio Vives and his colleagues have said is, look at these 8 parameters, right? Depending on the value of these parameters in a particular project context, decide whether you should do it public or PPP. So in a particular project context, political willingness might be very high. If political willingness is very high for a PPP, yes, you can certainly do it in the public domain, right? That is certainly a possibility, but you can also do it in any of these 3 other modes as well, okay? So all 4 of these modes then become possible, right? Similarly, if willingness to pay is there, then there is nothing preventing you from doing it in the public domain, but certainly, right, you could try doing a PPP, right, because people are willing to pay for that project. So for good water, right, for instance, or reliable power, people might be willing to pay a little bit extra. So take your particular project, right, go through each of these parameters and figure out which of these modes are possible, and then you will find that each column will have a number of diamonds in it, right. So you then pick the column with the most diamonds as your best project choice. So in this case, the public column has the most diamonds, right. So you're probably better off during doing this project in the public domain rather than in any of the on the public sector procurement mode rather than in any of the other project delivery mode. So these things on the top, these column titles on the top are what we call project delivery modes, right. You can deliver the project in any of these ways. You can deliver it through public procurement, you can deliver it through BOT, you can deliver it through management contracts. These are all options for you to deliver, right. Which is the best option for your project? Take your project, let's go through these variables one by one, 1 through 8, and then decide which is the most optimal option for us, right. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies, right, where we'll look at what happened in those cases and we'll look at applying these frameworks, okay.